Hello and welcome to an introductory lecture on Sunzi's Art of War. We'll begin with some central themes. The first is that nothing is decided in advance. It doesn't matter if you're the strongest, the mightiest, the most intelligent, if you have the largest army or the best weather and best terrain. Nothing can be decided in advance. Winning depends on taking whatever circumstances prevail and using it to your advantage. It means manipulating the way things are so that everything seems to turn your way. And we'll discuss how Sunzi thinks this is possible in this lecture. The first big point, right, is that everything that a person does should be in accordance with Tao. If the aim is to get the most out of the current circumstances, Tao is the foundation, Tao is the reason, Tao is what is happening. And just like many Chinese philosophers, Sunzi thought that there are certain people that can grasp onto it. And once you have that grasp, then you use the current of Tao to bring about whatever you prefer. From just a tiny quote from the Sunzi, which ruler has the right way is what this means in Chinese, and it is the first most important part of ensuring victory in war. The second point, the second thing I want to talk about is something that our interpreter, our translator of the Sunzi, Professor Roger Ames, says, will help us to understand the cosmology, the metaphysics, the thoughts that are operating in the background of this philosophy. And he describes it using the metaphor of focus field. So basically, the world is irreducibly complex. There's no way that you can ever understand everything as it's happening all at once. The world is a vast but interlocking whole. Everything is connected, and everything is playing out all at once. And rather than striving to understand each individual thing, event, process, the central notion is that we can learn to respond well, that we can put ourselves in a position to where we're not disadvantaged, but actually helped by all the things moving all at once, that we can utilize the inertia of the movement of all things to pull ourselves along. So we respond either well or not so well. And I think we could say that the playing of chess, right, playing the game of chess is a really good example. As you may or may not know, if you play chess, you're never going to win if you're really focused on, well, I got to get my queen to go here and here and here so that I can checkmate, so that I can win this game. Because what it risks is missing the subtle movements that your opponent is making. The way to win at chess is to modify your strategy with each of their moves, to be not only planning your moves in advance, but planning what they might do in advance. And, for professional chess players, it involves knowing your opponent well, watching their old matches and watching, what they do as they move their pieces around. All of this, we could say that it also is irreducibly complex. You can't play out the whole game of chess before it even, as it begins to start. You have to, at each moment, be constantly reformulating, constantly adjusting to things. And I think this makes an appropriate metaphor for the metaphor of focus field. So the world as a whole is complex and in its entirety impossible to grasp. It is we could say, the background of all our experience. All the things going on that we're not thinking about, that would comprise the field. And anything we turn our attention to, anything we seek to modify, anything we find very important, illuminating, or interesting, becomes our focus. So it's not that the two are distinct, it's that we focus in on parts of the field. We bring our attention to, we begin to change parts of it. But our changes, our influence, affects the field at large as well. In another way of speaking, we could say that each focus contains the field, right? It contains everything, all the complexity of all the things that we don't know. But it's sort of a smaller bite to take, right, of the irreducible complexity of everything, right? What we bring our attention to, our focus, gives us the context of the things that we do, right? Gives it meaning, gives a scope to our influence. So as I said before, everything is connected. Right, so just because we're focused on something doesn't mean we bring it out of the field. We just bring it into focus, right? If everything is so complex that it's vague, we could say that it's blurry. It's impossible to see everything with the distinctness that comes when we focus in on something. We could call the field the macrocosm and the focus the microcosm. They're connected. Whatever happening in your focus is also happening in the field, right? The idea is, if we bring things into focus, we can optimize our experience. We can optimize our relationship. We can get the most out of it, right? So instead of trying to trying to understand the field all at once, where our impact would be small, minuscule. If we bring things into focus, those things around us, those things in our immediate proximity become achievable, become knowable, become completely knowable. And in our small macrocosm, we can bring things into harmony, right? Bring things into a situation in which everything benefits one another. That's the idea of the focus, is that, and the idea that expands broadly in the Sunzi, that if you can order your own surroundings, then you've ordered a small part of the macrocosm. And if you've ordered it sufficiently, the idea is sort of in a concentric way, like concentric circles when you throw a rock into a pond and then the ripples going outward. This idea that if you order your macrocosm, the impact may be so great that it fans out across the field. So the way that one would describe the Sunzi for this metaphor is that typically we think of war as domination, that there are two sides or more, but let's just keep it simple. Two sides and one wins, right? And but this idea that the impact that you're capable of having is small in relation to the rest of the field, but big in terms of the impact within your focus. The idea, the idea is that if you can accord with Tao, right, if you can kind of latch on to the movements that are already occurring, that you can use this force, this inertia, this movement to bring about something that would be beneficial to you. There's an idea that if things are not beneficial, if things are, if there are floods and droughts, if there's a sense in which senseless war is not beneficial. There's the idea that one can subtly make corrections to the way things are. If one reads correctly the circumstances in accord with Tao, one sees more of the field. And with this view of the field, one can see that there's nothing there that doesn't belong there. There's nothing there that needs to be erased. There are things that are chaotic. There are things that are disruptive, and they need to be corrected. So it's a different way of looking at war in terms of, well, this is what's happening, but it's not the way they ought to be happening. So we need to subtly shift the way that things are moving to put them back in the right direction. So it brings up a very interesting question, whether war is natural, whether war, as you answered in your Taoism and war videos, is inevitable. If one wins a war by understanding the circumstances themselves have led to war. And the idea is that if you understand how the war came about, you can understand how to correct it, how to resolve it. This is why the emphasis is on circumstances, right? Not just your enemy's actions, not just your actions, but about how all of it forms the field of experience and how your knowledge of particular foci, the plural of focus, can bring about the result that you want, how you can begin to use the circumstances to your advantage, to correct the circumstances so that the order that makes sense will come to prevail. And I want to say just a little word about centripetal harmony. So, as you know, but as I'll sort of reiterate, the introduction and notes are not by Sunzi, and the translation, right, into English is clearly not by Sunzi. They are all the version I gave you, written by this man, Professor Roger Ames. And so if you quote things from the text, be sure to, be mindful of when you're quoting him and when you're quoting the Sunzi text. And I just included, in order to explain this concept of centripetal harmony, I've put this quote here, but before I read it, I'll just describe a little bit of what it might mean. So Professor Ames is using the metaphor typically seen in, physics, right? That there are certain forces that draw things in toward a center, right? That instead of by their own inertia shooting off away, they're kept in this arc, this rotation around a certain object. So Professor Ames wants to make a metaphor of this force to put the commander at the center. The commander is the force that brings everything in. Professor Ames writes, the exemplary commander in the context of warfare stands as the self-organizing center, where the chaos of battle, far from interfering with order, feeds in and stimulates it. So it's this idea that if the right person is in charge, then everything around them, the relationships that the commander forms with all the people around them, the understanding of the various foci, of all the events unfolding around them, that they'll have this ability to subtly manipulate all of these things. That even things that seem chaotic can be harnessed by this self-organizing center. They can be harnessed by the understanding that if you optimize all the things around you, if you become the knowledgeable center of things, if you put yourself in a position to be able to subtly control everything that's going on around you, then you can harness all of the forces of the world, right? You can harness all of the movement of Tao itself to lead things right where you need them to be. Why swim against the current when you can swim with it? So we have this moderately famous quote. I mentioned in the previous slide the ability to subtly manipulate, right? So we have this quote, the sentence in black is Professor Ames' translation. The sentence in blue is mine. So they're both translations of the same Chinese words. Roger Ames translates it as, warfare is the art of deceit. I translate it, warfare follows the way of trickery, right? That you never want to, if you want to win war, it's almost as if we could say that you have to be as obscure and vague as Tao itself. If people can see right through it, if people can grasp it and understand it, it's not worth understanding, right? If people can get a sense of where it is and where it's going quite easily, then they can head you off, right? They can defeat you before you even start it. So the idea is to always appear in a way that you're not. If you have a small army, appear very large. If you have a small army, have a bunch of people like stamping about, raising a lot of dust, build a lot of fires so that at night it looks like there are more campsites than there really are. The idea is that if you're going to win without fighting, then you have to always trick your enemy into retreat, trick your enemy into surrendering, trick your enemy into thinking that they're already beaten when in fact they may have the largest army. They may have the most experienced archers, but there are ways to use the circumstances. There is always a way to use the circumstances to your advantage. And this is through deceit, the creation of an illusion of what's there instead of being able to see directly what's really there. want to say a little bit about strategic advantage. The idea that you can make the most of your circumstances, and no matter what's happening, no matter what conditions there are, you can always use it to your advantage. This is the sign of a truly excellent commander. So, and as I've mentioned before, if we think about Taoist metaphysics, if we think about the Tao Te Ching, what we've been, over and over again talking about is that Tao moves. Everything's in motion. The only thing that never changes is that things are always changing. So just like in a game of chess, when you're, organizing your next move and you're taking into account what your opponent is doing and what they might do and what your plan is and how you should adjust, there's this sense of everything is moving of its own accord, and you're just trying to focus in on it as it moves. So the best way isn't to be like, okay, I pinned it down. This is what it means, because as things move away, here you are back here, understanding how things were in the past. The idea is to respond, to get a sense of where things are naturally going. So eventually you can shape it and bring it in a different direction. That's how you would gain the strategic advantage. And there are a few memorable metaphors in the book. I hope that you're enjoying them. But one of them is, once you've manipulated things to your advantage, victory is all but certain, right? One metaphor is, if you raise water high enough, then when it crashes down, when it comes over the edge of the waterfall, it can crush huge boulders that before would have, they would block a whole stream. But if water falls from great heights, it can crush, right? And probably the most memorable one for me is if you gain the strategic advantage, winning is like throwing a big rock into a basket of eggs, like splat. Like there's nothing the eggs can do, right? The eggs lost before they even engaged in this resistance against this huge rock that you threw. The idea is these are all natural things. I mean, none of them are had to be created. I mean, this is just facts of the world, that a large stone will crush eggs and that a waterfall, consistently just beats on the ground below it until it turns it into dust. And these metaphors are used to, illustrate that when you've gained strategic advantage, you have that level of force. If the enemy doesn't give in, then they will be crushed. And I hope that as you're reading it, you're comparing it with the Tao Te Ching. You read a lot of the Tao Te Ching, and there are some things that I think kind of glimmer through. The Sunzi was likely written after the Tao Te Ching, so it's some scholars think that the influence has sort of penetrated in, even if the source isn't cited directly. But I think as a practice, it's good to just, compare and contrast, because you are developing into an expert in ancient Chinese philosophy. So it's good to keep that critical part of your mind sort of open and flowing. So I've chosen one topic that is shared by, I think, both the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu here, and Sunzi here, right? The author of Sunzi bingfa. We think so, as we get into this whole purported author thing again, but as you read in the introduction. But here's the idea, right? In war, everybody loses. The losses of life, the losses of resources are enormous, even if you win. So it's best not to go to war in the first place. For the Sunzi, the best strategy, or the best sort of way to defeat, is to attack strategies, right? Before you even get to armies facing off against each other, the best way to win is to let your enemy know that they're beaten before the battle even begins. And this is part of the rehearsal process, right? That if you plan everything out in advance and you have all these different things in order, and in the temple rehearsal, which was an actual thing, you're overwhelmingly likely to win the battle. You could use this to convince your opponent that they've already lost. But one thing that's a little different from the Tao Te Ching, and I think has a lot of room to talk about, is this idea that in order to win, one must take control of the situation first, rather than waiting to respond to whatever the enemy does, right? In the Tao Te Ching, we saw the exact opposite, right? That if someone attacks, then you step back, right? There's always this, in the Tao Te Ching, there was always this reaction, right? That there's always this, the best way is to let your aggressor come at you and then respond in, and typically in an evasive way. For the Sunzi, it's it's not always be on the offense all the time, right? It's that if you want to be on the defense, force your enemy to strike you, right? If you want to put them in a defensive position, make sure they never have the opportunity to create an offensive position, right? If you want to go to battle with someone, always arrive first so that you can set the stage, so that you can begin to mold the circumstances in your favor, and they arrive already in your circumstances. That's the idea. That it doesn't mean that you always have to, be the one to engage. In fact, you could say that you're already engaging before you're engaging. You're setting the stage for them to have to attack you, and you're ready, right? So this idea of arriving first, or attacking first, or taking the first move can sometimes mean provoking your opponent even though they don't know that you're provoking them. So again, you set the circumstances. You've already begun manipulating it, and then they have to fight in your world, so to speak. I hope this short introduction helped you understand some of the themes going into the Sunzi, and we'll talk about this more in the next video.